In the ballot, the streets are both. August Nimtz provides a thorough survey of the approach that Marx and Engels, and later Lenin and the Bolsheviks, took toward electoral politics and the institutions of bourgeois democracy. It concludes that their approach, revolutionary parliamentarism, as Lenin began calling it after 1914, was essential to the success of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Marxists consider poverty, racial and gender oppression, war, environmental devastation, and basically all popular grievances to be both interconnected and to share a common source, capitalism. So the goal of Marxists is to change the global mode of production, the way we make things, from capitalism to socialism. We want to end the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and begin the dictatorship of the proletariat. Those are stark terms that emphasize the Marxist view of the state as, quote, nothing but a machine for the oppression of one class by another, and indeed in the democratic republic, no less than in the monarchy. That's Engels. And the Communist Manifesto says that, quote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, end quote. This informs the strategies and tactics of Marxists. We see the capitalist state as a weapon in the hands of the capitalist class, an antagonistic force that must be opposed, not improved or integrated with. As Trotsky said, the social democracy considers itself the democratic doctor of capitalism, whereas we are its revolutionary gravediggers. So how is progressive social change achieved according to revolutionary socialists? Reform and social progress happen when the working class and oppressed make temporary advances in their irreconcilable conflict with the capitalist class. Trotsky said that the general Marxist thesis, social reforms are only the byproducts of the revolutionary struggle, has in the epoch of the decline of capitalism the most immediate and burning importance. The capitalists are able to cede something to the workers only if they are threatened with the danger of losing everything, end quote. Marxists believe in democracy, but only a highly circumscribed sham democracy is possible under capitalism, where political power flows solely from economic power. Lenin said that, quote, the proletariat alone is capable of bringing about the complete democratization of the political and social system, since this would place the system in the hands of the workers. Marxists also believe in self-emancipation. Liberation cannot be given, it must be taken. Self-emancipation is not a strategic or tactical choice, but the only way to win socialism. The working class must seize power by and for itself through revolution and the democratic reorganization of society. Every other approach at social transformation invariably leads away from the goal of workers' power. To accomplish self-emancipation, the working class must go from being a class of itself to a class for itself, a class that knows who it is and who its enemies are, that coheres itself into a force that can fight for its interests. This is not only what Marxists say workers should do, but a description of how the history of class struggle has unfolded and continues to unfold time and time again around the world. So it's not only prescriptive, but descriptive. A rise in class consciousness, class coherence, and class struggle corresponds directly to levels of independent organization and militancy. Workers' councils are one form of organization that workers have independently invented time and again around the world and throughout the history of industrial capitalism. Most well known as Soviets in revolutionary Russia in the early 1900s, they also emerged in revolutionary Chile in the early 70s as cordones, revolutionary Iran in the late 70s as shoras, and by many other names in Germany, Hungary, Algeria, China, Mexico, and elsewhere, as we've been studying. Workers making decisions where they work, amongst their workmates, about their work, and about the municipality around them, using a system of instantly recallable delegates, results in a higher level of democracy than parliamentary democracy. Ultimately, a revolutionary party must emerge as the crystallization of class coherence. This is one place Marxism contrasts with anarcho-syndicalism, which opposes the idea of a revolutionary party, of electoral struggle, and of a worker state. And as a result, anarcho-syndicalist politics will never lead to revolution, nor, if they did, to communism. Social democracy, now called democratic socialism, seeks to attain the goals of socialism within the framework of capitalism. Revolutionaries agree that we must fight for reforms, but the important part is the fight, not the reform. Reformism is the idea that reforms alone can give us what we seek with no systemic rupture. Social democratic ideas are providing grave misleadership to the current socialist movement by redirecting discontent, grassroots struggle, and the rising interest in socialism into the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is an irredeemably undemocratic tool of capital that cannot be taken over, reformed, or utilized by the working class. On the contrary, the Democratic Party remains an impediment to the crystallization of working class consciousness and organization. This is not despite, but due to, or because of the growth of a democratic socialist wing within it. The Democrats' historic role as the gravediggers, the Democrats' historic role as the graveyard of social movements has not changed. Its role is to absorb and neutralize discontent by routing it harmlessly into an arena controlled by capital. As the parties of liberal bourgeoisie have done throughout history, the Democrats tend to the longer-term interests of the system by making minor concessions and major rhetorical appeals to our interests. FDR was class conscious of his role in granting the New Deal, which staved off revolts and revolution while maintaining the racist regime of capital and advancing the US imperial project. He said, "I'm the best friend the profit system ever had." This is the socialist that Bernie Sanders compares himself most to these days. While most of the liberal left in the US seeks to advance through the Democratic Party and the electoral system more broadly, Marxists point to class struggle as the motor force of history, specifically mass, independent, militant, working class action. Calling it independent working class action means class independent, meaning independent of the big and petty bourgeoisies. Not involving them, not sharing organization with them, not taking money from them, as the Democratic Party and the NGO complex, as do the Democratic Party and the NGO industrial complex that surrounds it. Class struggle is primarily advanced through strikes, protests, occupations, and uprisings, and the organizational forms required to execute such actions, like trade unions, workers' councils, political parties, tenants' unions, revolutionary groups. Class struggle must not be limited by what is legal, as the law simply legitimizes the profit system. Everything we do in the here and now should be in the service of the future emergence of the class for itself. We cannot advance toward revolution unless an increasing number of workers engage in mass, independent, militant action and organize themselves accordingly. As one of the readings said, in order for the working class to learn how to defend itself, constitute itself as a power in its own right, and overthrow the highly armed and ideologically coherent capitalist state, a process of political education, self-organization, critique, and experience is required. And it just so happens that this is also the best way to win reforms. So what can we learn from the history of the socialist left's approach to elections? The Marxist political tradition warns us against what Engels called parliamentary cretinism, a tendency to place all hope for social change in parliamentary institutions. But even socialists trained in Marx have shown they are not immune. Before 1900, when many dozens of German socialists won election to parliament, Engels became increasingly alarmed at the rise of opportunist and reformist tendencies. Leading member of the German Social Democratic Party, Karl Kautsky, once known as the Pope of Marxism, went so far as to call parliamentary activity, quote, the most powerful lever that can be utilized to raise the proletariat out of its economic, social, and moral degradation. Around that time, at the turn of the century, Rosa Luxemburg railed against such tendencies. She said, people who pronounce themselves in favor of the method of legislative reform in place of and in contradistinction to the conquest of political power and social revolution do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. Instead of taking a stand for the establishment of a new society, they take a stand for the surface modifications of the old society. In the run-up to the Russian Revolution in October 1917, the Mensheviks formed blocks with and gave critical support to the liberal bourgeoisie in the legislature. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks showed them nothing but hostility and insisted on proletarian independence from even its staunchest allies. The history of socialists' attempts to reform the state and vote socialism into power has resulted in socialists adapting to nationalism, becoming managers of austerity and imperialism, disorienting and disorganizing the working class, and making no advance toward overturning the reign of capital. This is true across the history of European socialism, from the Second International's betrayal of the international working class by supporting their own national bourgeoisies in World War I, to the Euro-communism in the 70s and 80s, all the way up to Syriza, about 10 years ago. In the 1930s, the Communist Party in the US pursued a class collaborationist policy that led them to support FDR and the Democrats. This undermined the possibilities for a militant labor movement, significant social reforms, and left-wing politics, including an independent labor party in the US. Today, the DSA is doing the same thing, squandering rising interest in socialism. Many other US socialists, including James Cannon, Hal Draper, and Eugene Debs, upheld the Marxist principle of class independence. Debs said, the worker who votes the Republican or Democratic ticket does worse than throw his vote away. He's a deserter of his class and his own worst enemy. And James Cannon offered this great defense of class independence. He said, it has been argued that we must go through the experiences with the workers. That is a very good formula, provided we do not make it universal. We go with the workers only through those experiences which have a class nature. We go with them through the experiences of strikes, even though we may think a given strike untimely. We may even go with the workers through the experience of putting a reformist labor party in office, provided it is a real labor party and subject to certain pressures of the workers, in order that they may learn from their experience that reformism is not the correct program for the working class. But we do not go through the experience of class collaboration with the workers. There we draw the line. We did not go through the experience of the workers when they supported the imperialist war. We drew back when they went through the experience of people's fronts in Europe. We stood on the side and we told them they were wrong. We did not compromise ourselves. If another man takes poison, you do not have to join him in that experiment. Just tell him it is no good, but do not offer to prove it by your own personal example. So what does a revolutionary socialist approach to elections look like? While Marxists do not consider the capitalist state to be a vehicle for socialist transformation, we also oppose abstentionism. We don't counterpose elections to strikes, protests, occupations, and uprisings. Rather, we seek to integrate all forms of struggle into a comprehensive strategy for revolution. While we decry the limitations of bourgeois democracy, we prefer it to the alternatives under capitalism, such as fascism or authoritarianism. Political freedoms like the right of assembly, association, free speech, a free press are valuable weapons that give us space to further our own class interests. And they're also gains from previous rounds of class struggle. For Marx and Engels, electoral victories were subordinate to independent working class political action. As an example, in 1850, they gave an address to the Communist League in London that 50 years later, Lenin found so compelling that he memorized it, enjoyed reciting it, and fought for it to become the core of Bolshevik electoral parliamentary strategy. From that address, here's a passage from that address. Quote, even when there is no prospect whatever of their being elected, the workers must put up their own candidates in order to preserve their independence, to count their forces, and to lay before the public their revolutionary attitude and party standpoint. In this connection, they must not allow themselves to be bribed by such arguments of the Democrats as, for example, that by doing so, they are splitting the Democratic Party and giving the reactionaries the possibility of victory. The ultimate purpose of all such phrases is to dupe the proletariat. The advance which the proletariat party is bound to make by such independent action is infinitely more important than the disadvantage that might be incurred by the presence of a few reactionaries in the representative body, end quote. So we hear this all the time, like, left candidates split the ticket and result in Republican victories. And Marx, Marx and Engels 150 years ago said, 170 years ago said, fuck that. So Marx and Engels are basically saying, winning isn't everything. Winning a particular election isn't everything. They encourage communists to run for office even when there is no prospect of being elected. For revolutionaries, the point is not to get elected. We don't want to become managers of austerity and imperialism for the capitalist state. We want to overthrow it. We don't want to dedicate our lives to tweaking the system or winning tiny concessions that can be swept away with the stroke of a pen. Marx and Engels emphasized preserving class independence and highlighted two purposes of electoral campaigns. One, to count our forces, to gauge support. The forces that we want to count are not a majority of the electorate, but effective supporters, activists, and militants willing to, quote, vote with their feet to resist the regime. Election returns went into Lenin's calculus in convincing Bolshevik leadership when the October insurrection should take place, for instance. This counting of forces was very important to that. And two, the second point of an electoral campaign is to, quote, lay before the public our revolutionary attitude and party standpoint. In other words, to propagate socialist ideas and stoke independent struggle. Electoral campaigns and elected offices can serve as big platforms to expose the system. But nowhere do Marx and Engels here mention changing the system from within. The focus is always on the movement, on the self-activity of militant workers. Lenin warned that socialists elected to the First Duma should avoid getting sucked into the minutiae of lawmaking. This is what Engels called project mongering. Instead, elected socialists should focus on making appeals to the people. In the revolutionary period that still gripped much of the industrialized world after the Russian Revolution, the Marxist or Bolshevik approach to elected office was generalized by the Third International in 1920. It resolved that, quote, the Communist Party does not enter these institutions, bourgeois governments, in order to carry out organic work there, in other words, reforms, but in order to help the masses from inside Parliament to break up the state machine and Parliament itself through action. So in conclusion, where does this all leave us? Should we support independent left candidates outside of the two dominant capitalist parties? This was the practice of our former organization, the ISO, for some time, which supported some Green Party candidates. It seems that the organization was uncomfortable with not having an answer to questions about who to vote for. Since the ISO dissolved in the Denver Communists, we've gotten comfortable answering, there is no one to vote for. There are no electoral solutions to the problems we face. Our power lies elsewhere. There is a crisis of legitimacy around elections, and while most socialists try to assuage people's concerns and bring them back into the system, we have chosen to affirm that crisis, that crisis of legitimacy. So should we support the lesser evil? Should we support left candidates of bourgeois parties? In 1906, Lenin addressed the matter of socialists forming blocs with liberals to stave off reactionaries in this way. Quote, "We would undermine the principles and the general revolutionary significance of our campaign for the sake of gaining a seat in the Duma for a liberal. We would be subordinating class policy to parliamentarism instead of subordinating parliamentarism to class policy. We would deprive ourselves of the opportunity to gain an estimate of our forces. We would lose what is lasting and durable in all elections, the development of class consciousness and solidarity of the socialist proletariat. We would gain what is transient, relative, and untrue, the superiority of the cadet over the Octoberist." That's the liberal over the reactionary. When Marxists speak of a party, we're talking about a formation focused on winning the class struggle, not simply elections. Class struggle must be fought on all fronts. I'll end by giving Lenin the last word. Quote, "This may sound paradoxical, but its truth is confirmed by the whole history of the international social democratic movement." He means socialists there. "Reformist tactics are the least likely to secure real reforms. Actually, reforms are won as a result of the revolutionary class struggle, as a result of its independence, mass force, and steadfastness. Reforms are always false, ambiguous. They are real only in proportion to the intensity of the class struggle. By merging our slogans with those of the reformist bourgeoisie, we weaken the cause of revolution and consequently the cause of reform as well, because we thereby diminish the independence, fortitude, and strength of the revolutionary classes." Thanks.